One of the most popular episodes that I've done so far is called Data Privacy Isn't As Important As You Think, in which I argue. I give 3 arguments for thinking just what it says. Data privacy isn't as important as you think. For someone who vehemently disagrees with me, you can listen to Carissa Valise. She's a professor of philosophy at Oxford. I had a conversation with her about privacy and her book, Privacy is Power, about a year ago in season 1 of Ethical Machines. And so it makes sense to bring it back. Maybe you've heard my episode and maybe you want a counterpoint. Well, this is a great counterpoint. Some of the arguments that I bring up in my own episode, I also raise with her, the Achilles example, for instance, and you get to decide, what side of the fence do you want to be on? So I'm bringing back this episode. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's one of the great ones. This conversation with Carissa Valise is totally fascinating to me, and the truth of the matter is that I don't really know where I stand on the issue, which is one thing that makes it so interesting to me. We're talking about privacy and data privacy in particular, and I want to set this conversation up because it's a complex one, and it's important that the backdrop is clearly articulated so you see the background against which this conversation is happening. So I'm going to say 4 things here. I want to highlight 4 things. Number 1, when people talk about privacy, especially in a corporate setting, not only, but especially in a corporate setting, they might be talking about one of 3 kinds of things. Number 1, they might be talking about cybersecurity is essentially about making sure that only people who ought to have access to some data do in fact have access, and the people who ought not to have access to that data don't have access. That's the core of what cybersecurity is about. That's one way or bucket or approach or lens through which we might think about privacy. A second lens is regulatory compliance. So there are different places, California, the European Union, as 2 examples, that have regulations, laws around privacy and data privacy in particular. That's not about cybersecurity. That's about the kinds of things that, say, the kinds of data that companies are legally allowed to collect or what they're legally allowed to do with that data. So that's regulatory privacy, or thinking about privacy from a regulatory perspective. There's then a way of thinking about privacy that we might call an ethical sense of thinking about privacy. There's different ways of carving this up. At the core of it, though, at the end of the day, I think, and there's more nuance here, and I'll talk about that nuance with Carissa, but it's a matter of the extent to which people can have control over data that's about them. The extent to which you can tell a company or a government, no, you can collect that data. Yes, you can collect this data about me. You can use it for this, but not for that. So it's something like data privacy, at least at maybe I want to say the deepest level of ethics or something along those lines, or the most robust ethical standard for privacy, has something to do with the extent to which people have control over data that's about them. Okay, so that is the first thing that I want to say about privacy. Think about it in terms of cybersecurity perspective, a regulatory perspective, and an ethical perspective. And now put those first 2 perspectives to the side, because this conversation is really about that ethics aspect of privacy. So I've spoken to other people, for instance, Matt Rosenquist. You may have heard him in a previous podcast where we talk about the cybersecurity aspect of privacy. This is straightforwardly about the ethical conception or perspective on privacy. So that's what this conversation is about. That's the second thing I wanted to say. So first thing is these 3 ways of thinking about privacy, or 3 approaches. The second thing is that we're going to focus on the third way, which has to do with the ethical conception of privacy, which is largely, though certainly not solely, as Carissa will articulate, about the extent to which you and I, citizens, consumers, etc., have control over their data. The third thing I want to say is in my book, Ethical Machines, not the podcast, but the book, I spend a chapter talking about privacy and really trying to get clear on what privacy is all about. And that's, if you like, my official line on privacy. I've been toying, though, with an unofficial line, thinking about, do we really care, or ought we really care about privacy that much, data privacy that much? And let me give you just two reasons that I'm skeptical. At least I'm trying these thoughts on. I think it's important to try thoughts on and try ideas on, try positions on, see how they fit. If they don't fit, you get rid of them. But this is what I've been trying on lately. One reason why I get skeptical about people talking about privacy or data privacy is that they start saying things like, that's my data, my biometric data, or the data about what I look like or what I sound, or my medical data, or my data about my preferences, or what I watched on Netflix, or what books I bought from Amazon, whatever it is. That's my data because it's about me. And I just think that's too fast of an inference. It's one thing to say that there's some data about you. It's another thing to say that it's your data in some, legal sense of ownership, I imagine. An example that I like to use is that if you're sitting in a cafe, you see me walk in, you write down in your notebook, Reed Blackman entered the cafe at 10 a.m., I can't then go over to you. That's clearly data about me, but I can't, I don't think, go over to you, rip the page out of your notebook and say, that's my data. You would surely protest, look, it's data about you, but it's not your piece of data. It's my notebook, my pen, I wrote it down, etc. There's a disconnect between data about you or data about me and my data or your data. This is a data that we own. Since there's that gap between those things, I get a little bit skeptical, a little bit philosophically squeamish when people start playing fast and loose with the distinction between data about you and your data. That's one sort of source of skepticism. Another source of, if not skepticism, at least something that makes me chill out about the data privacy concerns, is that a lot of the data that is collected, and as Carissa will say, not all, but a lot of the data that's collected is stored in these spreadsheets or whatever kind of software it is, some kind of database stored in a server that no individual ever actually looks at. So we talk about things like corporations know what you like, they know what you watched, but that's anthropomorphizing them or giving them too much credit. Most organizations don't even know what kind of data they have, frankly. And it's very rare, and this is contentious perhaps, but it's usually not the case, I think that's fair to say, that there's some individual person looking at some spreadsheet, finding data about you or data about me and being like, oh, Reed watched that show last night, or he bought that book, or he went to this location at this time. I don't think that's usually what's going on. So then I start to think, we talk about corporate surveillance, but is this perhaps a bit metaphorical or overblown, at least in some cases, because there is data collected about us, but we don't really do anything with it. Okay, they don't know it, and it's unclear whether they're going to do anything with it. So those are my two reasons for being a little bit skeptical. I have more reasons, but I'm trying not to dive into a complete lecture, a diatribe. That's the third thing that I wanted to say. So I talked about, you didn't say anything. I talked about there's three ways of thinking about privacy. One of those ways is the ethical way that we want to focus on, that has to do with user control or people having control over data that's about them. And then two reasons that I think maybe this is not such a big deal after all. Number one, there's a difference between data about me and my data. And also the second point is that these companies don't always know. There's not some individual looking at data about us typically. It's just buried in a spreadsheet in a server somewhere or something along those lines. Now, this is an important backdrop, I think, to the conversation because I'm going to push in this conversation. You'll see me pushing Carissa to show me that I'm wrong. And I think she does an admirable job. I think she has made me certainly, in many ways, back off from my skepticism. Not completely. I'm not settled. These things need to marinate. You got to think about it for some time. But I feel the force of her arguments. One thing that I want to highlight in this discussion is a distinction that Carissa and I talk about. I talk about it in my book. She talks about it, I believe, in her book. And it's a distinction that philosophers generally, and Carissa and I both philosophers, or we have PhDs in philosophy. She's a professor. I once was. It's the distinction between harming or being harmed and being wronged. So a lot of times people will talk about we don't want to harm people, but at least in philosophical circles and circles where the ethicists are talk about harm as something like talk about physical or emotional harm. It feels like something to the person being harmed. But there are some cases in which, plausibly, you might be wronged even though you were not harmed. The most obvious case is when someone does something to you, but you don't know about it. For instance, let's say someone snitches on you. Someone tells the police that you did something illegal. You might not be harmed at the moment that they tell you, but let's suppose that it was a betrayal of trust. They may have arguably wronged you nonetheless, so you can be wronged without being harmed. Or here's one more example that Carissa and I talk about. Your spouse may systematically be cheating on you, but she or he is a really good deceiver and you never find out. Nonetheless, while you're not being physically or emotionally harmed because you don't know about it, nonetheless, arguably, presuming that you don't have some sort of arrangement with your significant other, you're being wronged. One thing to keep in mind here, then, this important distinction between being harmed and being wronged is that privacy violations, from this ethical sense, is often plausibly a matter not of being harmed, but of being wronged. The fact that the companies or the government collects certain data about you makes it the case that you're being wronged, even if you don't know what they're doing. That is to say, even though you're not being physically or emotionally harmed by the collection or the use of that data, not necessarily, nonetheless, they're having it, they're collecting it, constitutes a wrong by virtue of violating your right to privacy, which has to do with you having control over your data. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but that's the backdrop. So we're trying to think carefully about whether we really should take these data privacy concerns so seriously, or if the sort of, if you like, the facelessness or the fact that it's almost anonymous, that it's just in the server that no one cares about, that you don't legally own the data, so it's not yours. How do we think about the importance of privacy, data privacy, from an ethical perspective? That's what the conversation about. And Chris is going to, I think, lean on the issue of, in many cases, even if you're not being harmed, you're being wronged. Okay, that was quite a long intro. I hope you stuck with it. But that should also, I hope, guide you through the conversation that I'm about to have with Carissa. Two sort of housekeeping kinds of things. Number one, if you like the show, like the pod, is it a show? Podcast? Please review it, 5 stars, whatever. Tell your friends about it. Really appreciate it. Always trying to get the word out. And then the second thing is, if you have an issue that you want me to discuss on the podcast, or you have a person to recommend that you'd like to hear me have a chat with, or you have just ethical questions as they pertain to AI or really any other emerging technology or technology generally, please send me an email. EM as in ethical machines, em@reedblackman.com. Send me that email. I will check it personally. I will not have an assistant do it, and I will see the email, and I would love to hear what you want to hear about. I'm always looking for topics to talk about, topics that you want to hear more about. Anyway, enough from me. It's enough babbling. Thanks so much for listening, and let's get to it. Chris, I love the title of your book, Privacy is Power. So tell me, though, what do you mean by privacy? What do you mean by power? And why is one the other?
Thank you. I'm glad you like the title. It's one of those things that came really easily, and that was a relief, because sometimes it's so hard to come up with the right title. But in this case, it came really easily because I thought that was one aspect of data that people were missing out on. At the time, a lot of people were talking about data protection and a lot of legalistic debates, and they were missing out on this crucial aspect that it's not only about money, it's about power. And I think that has changed in the past couple of years in the debate, not only because of my book, but also other people have started talking about power, and that has been really helpful. So privacy, there's a technical definition that I could give you, but that would be probably getting into too much detail. But roughly, privacy is about having the capacity to keep certain things to yourself or to share them with just a few chosen others, and to keep certain kind of access to yourself from others that you don't want to have that kind of personal access to. So it's not only about information, but it's also the capability of not being seen or heard. And that goes beyond information, because I think as mammals, we have this very visceral reaction to being seen. That it's not only about the kind of information that someone can glean from you, but that it also makes you feel like possible prey. And power, again, there are more technical definitions, but roughly, when somebody has power over you, they have the ability to make you do things that you would otherwise not do. And there are different kinds of power, so there are different classifications, but one way to separate the different kinds of power is between soft power and hard power. So soft power would be the kind of power that someone has over you through seduction, through narrative, through kind of soft means. And hard power would be, the paradigm would be physical power. So if somebody is violent towards you. But there is an interesting kind of hard power in tech, because when code makes you do something, it's not physically violent, but it is something that is done unto you in a way that you have no agency over.
Okay, so there's already a ton to unpack there. So first, one thing that I really like about the way you articulated privacy is that it's a capacity that people have. You didn't just say something like it's the state of not being known or the state of not being seen. You said something like it's a capacity to let people see you or not see you, or something along those lines. So we talk about a right to privacy. It's a right that one exercises. It's not a passive state in which people just don't see you. So that's already interesting to begin with, because now we have to start thinking about if a company respects people's privacy, using that conception of privacy, then it's not merely a matter of them not looking at certain things, but a matter of empowering the citizen, the user, the consumer, whatever, to exercise their right. So it sounds like the corporation that typically collects data has to make room in the way that they interact with you for you to exercise that right to privacy. That's one interesting thing. So first of all, do I have that right so far?
Yes, I think you do. And if you want to be really precise, I think the distinction would be between privacy and the right to privacy. And privacy is about access. So you can have somebody unconscious and in a room alone, and they have privacy without having any kind of capacities.
Right.
But then there's a right to privacy, and that has to do with having certain kinds of control over personal access to yourself and over certain kinds of information about yourself.
So then when you say privacy is power, do you mean the active? The active, so do you mean something more? Is that shorthand for the right to privacy is power?
I think it's both. And it's partly because this is a book that is not academic and it's
Sure.
accessible. So I wanted to conform to regular usage of the word. But even just not being accessed by certain kinds of institutions gives you a kind of power. So I think power lies both within privacy and the right to privacy.
Okay, now let's talk about this power stuff. So my confession is something like I always find talk about power weird in a way. It's the thing to do is to talk about power now and power structures and undoing power structures. If you're of a certain political persuasion, you want to undo power structures. And I always thought it depends. We don't want power to be unjustly distributed. We want power to be justly distributed. I take it that doesn't mean that everyone should have exactly the same amount of power. Governments have power over its people, and in the cases in which it's a justified government or a legitimate government, they ought to have that power. Talking about power in a kind of ethicsy context seems to me downstream or something like that of talking about who ought to have power. We want to undo the power structures on the condition that the power structures ought to change, not just because we like moving power around. It's fun to do.
That's an excellent point. And my concern here was that the citizenry, as part of a democracy, is losing too much power to sustain a healthy democracy. So, of course, the government should have more power than any kind of citizen in different ways, like to collect taxes and to have a police and so on and so forth. But there is a balance to be had. And when the government has too much power and the citizenry has too little power, it's very difficult to sustain that kind of demos that is the ideal. If you think about your own life and you think about how you're losing exactly how you're losing privacy, it's easy to feel very disempowered because even if you're very careful, even if you do your best, you are going to lose very sensitive personal data that could count against you or against your family members or against your community, and there's very little that you can do about it. And that is remarkable in democratic societies. Typically that kind of status is related to being a subject of an autocratic regime, like in Russia or like in East Germany or in China.
So is your focus more about data privacy as it relates to corporations? And you said earlier, you said something along the lines of they make you do certain kinds of things. That what you were trying to locate the kinds of power that corporations have in the hard power versus soft power distinction. And you said they make you do things, but now we're talking about governments. Is your primary concern? Do you have a primary concern, or do you think that the data privacy issue both relates to government power and corporate power?
It both relates to government power and corporate power. And there are two things to take into account. One is that for a while, we've thought about corporations as less threatening than the government because they don't have certain kinds of power, like they don't have a police force.
Sure.
But we should remember that in the past, corporations have been much more powerful than governments. So, for instance, the East India Company used to have more soldiers than the UK government. And when we think about colonialism, we tend to think about the UK government, but actually it was the East India Company. So let's keep that in mind to make sure that we don't have that kind of corporation that might have undue power. And the second reason why it's both about corporate and government power is because in this day and age, corporations and governments interchange data very easily. So when the government collects data, it very often ends up in the hands of corporations. When corporations collect data, it almost always ends up in the hands of governments.
Okay, I want to push more on the corporation stuff. I mean, I really like your point that there's not this sort of clean division between corporate data possession and government data possession, since they share data back and forth, or at least it goes from corporations to government, if not the other way around. But so let me sort of take the extreme position and say, okay, so what? So they have data about us, these corporations, but When we talk, especially in the context of looking out for something like a fascist government or something like that, gathering all of our data, looking at our family and friends, etc. These big companies are taking our data, but it's not like you've got like this tech bro in the room next door. It's like East Germany listening into your conversation. It's data that you're generating in concert with how you work with the platform, whatever it is. And actually, in your book, you point out it's not just obvious platforms, say a Facebook or an Instagram or a TikTok, your smart refrigerator, your smart TV, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a bunch of stuff. But then this data just gets collected, it gets aggregated, it gets stored in some server, it potentially gets disconnected from your name, or at the very least, I would think that in the vast majority of cases, 99.9% of cases, there's no individual person looking at Reed Blackman or Carissa Valise's name in a spreadsheet and being like, oh, he watched that show last night or whatever. So is my privacy really being invaded? I guess that's one question. Should I really consider that sort of thing a violation of my privacy? If so, is it that big of a violation of privacy? And does it really enable them to, as you put it, I know casually, make us do things?
Yes, the answer to all of those questions, I think,
Great,
is
good.
yes.
Thank you very much, and we're done here.
I think you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
So first of all, to the idea that there's no tech bro kind of looking at your camera or something.
Yeah.
Actually, in many cases, there is. We've read about cases in which tech workers have been listening to conversations with Siri and Alexa, sometimes very sensitive conversations having to do with your health, sometimes sex scenes, all kinds of things. I think the latest one has been Tesla, in which it's been recording scenes from people's garages, again, sometimes very sensitive. And there are people on the other side going through those kinds of images, partly to train the algorithm, partly for other reasons. And these people sometimes become whistleblowers because they feel genuinely uncomfortable. And there is a practice in many companies, this is a claim with Tesla, of people who stumble upon particularly sensitive images and they share them with their buddies because that's what some people do. So that's the first thing. But you might think, okay, it's creepy, but it doesn't worry me like too.
Or is it the exception to the rule or something along those lines? Yeah.
Yeah. But when all of this data gets collected, it ends up in the hands of data brokers. And data brokers have a file on you that might contain all kinds of things like what you search for online and what you post on social media, your purchasing power, your health status, all kinds of things. And they sell this data in a variety of forms. Sometimes it is very aggregated data, so you just become a drop in the ocean and it doesn't seem to matter that much. Although even then, there can be inferences that are then made from aggregated data that can be about someone like you that can have effect on your life. But in some cases, there are two cases that are particularly problematic. One is they sell lists of people. And when you look at the category of the lists, you get a sense of just how problematic this might be. So categories can include victims of a rape, people who have lost a child, people who suffer from premature ejaculation, people who are HIV positive. So there is a market for finding out about people's vulnerabilities. And there's a reason for that. It's not just like curiosity, right? That can have an effect when you ask for a loan, when you ask for a job, when you ask for an apartment, all kinds of things. And then it is possible to also buy a particular person's file. And one of the misleading issues around data is that very often we get told that our data is being anonymized or pseudonymized. And most of the time, that means very little because it's very easy to re-identify people. You typically only need 2 or 3 data points to re-identify people. So next time you ask for a job, if it's for a big company, there's a very good chance that that company is going to buy your personal file from a data broker that will contain all these kinds of information that are very sensitive and not aggregated at all.
It sounds like there are. So one thing that you're pushing, one way in which you're pushing back is saying something like, actually, Reed, that the extent to which you are an individual is explicitly identified, they're real. The rate at which that happens is greater than you think, Reed. I take it, the first point. Okay, that's interesting. And those seem like arguably violations of privacy. But let's take for a minute the cases in which there is no individual looking at my data. That it doesn't get de-anonymized, or there's no individual looking at it. It's just collected. Maybe an algorithm runs through it to see what ad is probably right for me. Is that a violation of my privacy?
So here's where it gets technical. And here I would argue that let's suppose that nobody ever looks at that data.
Yeah.
Even then, there is a violation of your right to privacy because you no longer have control to limit the access to that data, even if nobody accesses it. And that changes our relationships of power, right? So when you know that, let's say your employer has access to your health data, even if they never look at it, they might look at it. So it might make you do things that you wouldn't do otherwise, run more, and you might say that's good for you. But in many cases, it might not be good for you, or it might be the wrong thing because actually you have bad knees and you would rather do yoga, but you can't actually measure yoga, so you ended up doing running, right? Or if you know that your government has access to that data, you might really want to go to a protest. You might think it's the right thing to do, and it's just, and you might think, yeah, but is it worth the risk? Maybe not, and you stay home.
All right, I can see that point now. So that's something like, look, there's this data that's collected about me by corporations, which may or may not be shared with governments, and I don't know how they're going to use that data, but it may be used in some way against me. So, for instance, my employer might use it to judge whether I should get a promotion or I should be fired or whatever it is, get a bonus. Governments might use it for political purposes, political surveillance or something along those lines. And so, since I don't know what is going to be done with my data, I should be concerned that the data is being collected. And I feel like the harm or the wrong that's being done to me is something like undermining my autonomy because I'm doing things I wouldn't otherwise want to do for fear of, I don't know what the right word is here, fear of being harmed by government or corporation or both.
Yeah, so there's a paper by De Bruin in which he argues that violations of privacy affect negative liberty. And one of the ways in which it affects it is that
Sorry, can you say what negative liberty is? I know what you mean, but...
So negative liberty is a kind of liberty that is often associated with liberal democracies. And the idea is that you should be free to do what you want, to not have any kind of interference, not only active interference, but also passive interferences. So one of the examples that De Bruin gives is, if I remember correctly, is that if you know that your data is being collected and it will be used for deciding whether you get a job or not, then you yourself will affect your behavior, even if nobody technically steps in and changes it.
Sort of one of the standard problems with surveillance, right? It's not merely... So one thing that might be bad about surveillance is that people catch you doing things that they think you ought not to be doing, and then they arrest you or they assault you or whatever it is. But the other point is something like part of living a free life is to live unencumbered with the constant fear that some malicious or uncharitable viewer is looking at you to punish you or to hurt you in some way or other. And so you make different decisions, you act differently, and so there's a way in which you're unfree simply by virtue of being surveilled, because the surveillance leads to fear of being harmed, and so it changes your behavior, changes the way that you live your life, and that's an undermining of autonomy.
Yeah, so there are two ways of looking at it. One is the lens of liberalism, and there you would say you don't have negative freedom because you have certain kind of obstacles. One kind of obstacle is that actually if you do certain kind of things, the government or corporations will get involved in your life and you won't have that job or you will get fired or whatever it is. The other way is that there's a chilling effect in which you create your own obstacles in response to very reasonable fears. And the other way to look at it is through republicanism. So Philip Pettit has famously argued that it's not enough to be free to not have obstacles. And the example he gives is the master and the slave. So the slave, you cannot say of the slave that he is free, even if his master never interferes with him, because the slave knows that the master could interfere with him, even if he never does. And in that way, there's a different way in which you're unfree, and that changes the power relationships when there are privacy violations.
So I guess on the one hand, I'm sympathetic with what you're saying. On the other hand, I still want to resist a little bit. Yes, there are cases in which bad things happen. Two things, though. Number one, it still seems to me like it's the minority of cases, but maybe enough to say, nonetheless, it might be the exception to the rule, but the exceptions happen often enough such that we ought to be really concerned. The other thing, and maybe this is more of a philosophical point than it is a practical... God, did I just equate philosophical with non-practical? I just made myself nauseous. Maybe it's a more sort of a point that doesn't lead directly to a particular action, but it's a way of conceiving of things. So I'm less concerned about the possession of the data than what's done with the data. And just because people can do bad things with data about me doesn't entail that my privacy has been violated. So the example that I like to use here, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, is the following. So suppose that I work at some company and there's a fire alarm that goes off, and every time the fire alarm goes off, I notice that this guy in my office, Achilles, he covers his heel. And I'm like, huh, that's curious. He covers his heel every time. I bet his heel's vulnerable. And you fast forward, and Achilles and I get into a fight, it turns into a physical alteration. I go for his heel. I deal him the mortal blow, right? He's dead now. And then someone says, Reed, I can't believe you violated Achilles' privacy. And then I want to say, yeah, look, that wasn't the real wrong there. The fact that I infer that he's got some vulnerable point, I inferred some information about him that he wanted me not to know, that's not the real issue. The issue is that I used that information in a way to kill him. It's the killing that's the problem. Then I want to say something like the possession or the inferring of data about people, that's not the real sort of moral problem. It's the use. And so shouldn't we be worked up about the ways that people use data as opposed to the mere fact that they have it?
I think that's the way regulation has been thought about in recent times, and that's the way the kind of regulation we have is designed, and I think it's a mistake. One practical reason for which is a mistake is because it's very hard to police that data. So there's so much of it that if you don't regulate the way it's collected, you're not going to be able to check the way it's used. But above and
Yeah.
beyond practical concerns, here's an analogy to try to change your mind.
Yeah. So before you give that analogy, I just want to say I agree that there should be controls over what kind of data is collected. But that's a strategy to minimize bad use. It's not because the possession of that data itself constitutes a violation of privacy. At least that's the line that I'm trying on, so to speak.
Okay, so I agree that it's a strategy that's effective,
Yeah.
but I further argue that there is a wrong in collecting
Okay.
sensitive data. One reason, before I go to the analogy, is because even if, let's say, you're super well intentioned and you collect sensitive data for good reason, uh, just holding that personal data is exposing people to risks because hackers want that personal data all the time. So that in itself is a risk. But let's go with the analogy. So I just finished an academic book on privacy that's hopefully going to be published at the end of this academic year. No, at the end of this year, not the academic year. And I argue that privacy is a richly demanding good, a robustly demanding good. And I use this terminology from Philip Pettit again. And the idea is that there are certain goods that we only have if we have not only here and now, but also in relevant possible worlds. And privacy is similar to security in that sense. So what you're saying is, when it comes to the right to security, what matters is if you get hurt or shot. But you might see how that might be problematic if you think about two cases. One is a case in which, let's say, everyone in the world has the key to your apartment or to your house. And the fact is, most people are good people and they won't use that for anything. And maybe you will even have a neighbor who uses that key to bring you pie or fix a leak or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you give it to enough people, eventually you'll find someone who will want to use it to steal.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah, of course.
being realistic.
Yeah.
And the other example is, so imagine we have an occupying polity, and suddenly you see snipers in every corner, like targeting your head. And they're like, we're not doing anything. You can just carry on with your life. And if we never shoot, then
No
the
harm, no
wrong is
foul.
not in the having of the gun. The wrong is only if we shoot. But you can see how that puts you in a power position that you don't want to be in. And in the case of the Achilles, it's an interesting example because yes, the wrong is in the killing, but it's really interesting that had you not known about the heel, you wouldn't have been able to kill him.
Okay, I like this issue of the snipers. They're always pointing a gun at your head, and the fact that they don't actually ever shoot you doesn't mean that something like one, they were wronging you and having in aiming at you to begin with, and it actually makes your life go worse. I take it this is what you mean by it's a robust good. I take it you mean something like for it to be a robust. Is that I have the phrase right?
Yes, so a robust good is one that we have not only here and now, but in relevant possible worlds. So if you change your religion or you change your politics, you should still be able to enjoy privacy.
Okay, so it's a robust good because it's a good something like independently of the particular what philosophical or ethical views you happen to hold or something like that? Your
Independently,
identity?
no, independently of the current world. So when I say that I enjoy a right to privacy, it's not only that I enjoy privacy here and now, but that I know that my privacy will be respected, even if tomorrow the government changes, or even if, I don't know, I become a different religion, or even if it suddenly becomes very profitable to
And
sell
I,
my data.
and I take it it's a good because it's either a necessary condition or constituent of living well.
Yeah, it's something we value, like friendship or love, or some people think that democracy is another kind of value.
Okay, so the idea is privacy, I guess it's something like knowing that you're not in danger is an important good of life. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
Yeah, and it's not only about danger when it comes to privacy, it has to do with danger. So I think typically, for instance, women tend to be more privacy conscious because we feel more in danger in the
Hmm.
world, or in certain aspects. But it's also about feeling free to do certain things. So it's also about, it has to do with creativity, with relaxation. When you know someone's watching, it's hard to be as relaxed. It's hard to be as free to explore different activities.
Okay, so this is I'm gonna just again try on a line of thought. If you think, okay, there's a gun constantly at my head, yeah, that's gonna mess with your life. That's gonna mess with your inner satisfaction or inner tranquility. There's no question because you don't know whether the axe is gonna drop or the whatever the I'm mixing metaphors now or analogies, but you don't know what might happen. You might not know what happened, and that makes you justifiably freaked out. Your life is worse off. You change your behaviors in various ways to minimize the probability of getting shot, but it also means that you're curtailing certain activities that would be fulfilling, that sort of thing. So that's bad. But is it it's the, suppose I say, that just means the company should be more subtle about the collection of the data, right? If they're like snipers out there aimed at us, then we know. But as long as they do it very quietly, then no change in life. It's the knowledge that's the problem, not the collection of the data that's the problem.
Yeah, that's a good objection. And I guess it depends on whether you are fully utilitarian or consequentialist or not, right? So most people, I think, seem to care about whether their partner is being faithful to them, whether they know about it or not. So you might say the perfect world is one in which your partner is unfaithful to you because they're happier and you don't know about it, so you're happier. Everybody's great. And I think most people would say, no, that's not what I want. It's not what I want is not to know that my partner is being unfaithful. What I want is for my partner to be faithful. And in the same way, I think it matters to us to have privacy, a world in which suddenly you realize that you've been surveilled by a
Yeah.
peeping tom for 2 years, even though you didn't know about it and it didn't harm you or didn't apparently harm you, is not a comfortable world.
Yeah. So I think this brings out the distinction between being harmed and wronged, which I talk a fair amount a bit about, but few people really care. But I wish in the AI ethics world or the data ethics world, everyone's always talking about being harmed, and I wish they would talk about being wronged because it seems to me like there's plenty of ways of being wronged without being harmed. I'm just going to basically repeat what you said, which is something like if your spouse or your loved one is cheating on you and you don't know about it, nonetheless, you're not suffering any psychological or physical harm. You don't know, you seem happy, your spouse is a very good deceiver. So you're not being emotionally harmed or physically harmed, psychologically harmed. Nonetheless, you're being wronged. Then we could ask, so number one, you're being wronged. Number two, we can ask, in which scenario is your life going better? The one in which your spouse is perfectly deceiving you and cheating on you all the time, or the one in which that's not happening? And it seems, oh, the other one. I might not know that my life is going better in that second scenario, but it is going better. And if you take those things on board, then you think, okay, you can be wronged without being harmed. Your life can go worse if you're systematically being wronged, even though you don't know it. And so the way in which, and then you say, look, privacy is like that. We can be wronged even if we're not being harmed by, say, these corporations or by the governments. And we're wronged by virtue of their infringing on our right to exercise, by virtue of infringing upon our right to, by virtue of infringing upon our ability to exercise our right to privacy.
Yeah, or just violating our right to privacy. I think our right to privacy is inherently having to do with control. But yeah, something like that.
Does this discussion or does this claim go around the issue of talk about ownership of data? Because we haven't talked about my data versus your data. I often get rubbed the wrong way when people say this is my data. I think, no, it's data about you, but it's data about me, therefore it's my data. That's just a bad inference. If I write down on my notebook, Carissa entered the cafe at 10 o'clock, you can't come over and rip the page out of my notebook and say, that's my data. It is data about you, but it's not yours in any, certainly not in any legal sense. So I wonder if the way that you're posing things means that we don't have to talk about ownership of data, or is there something implied in your argument that does say something like, oh, yeah, this data about you, that's actually your data in some meaningful, I don't know, moral sense or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think language is like deceptive in this sense because there are many ways to interpret what does it mean to say my data. And I think a lot of people, as you correctly say, infer that there's some kind of ownership, but ownership seems to be something different. And
Yeah.
you can say my something without it necessarily implying that there's ownership there. One of the things I argue for in Privacy is Power is that even though personal data is obviously about ourselves, and in order to have our right to privacy respected, we need to have certain control over it. At the same time, it's a mistake to think that we have the moral authority to do whatever we want with our data, just like as if it were property. So if you have a house and it's yours, other things being equal, you can sell it, you can destroy it, you can whatever. But your personal data, more often than not, contains data about other people. Your genetic data, of course, contains data not only about your parents and siblings and kids, but also about distant cousins and distant kin that you might never have heard of. Your location data contains data about people who live and work nearby you. Your psychological data contains data about people who share that kind of profile. So whenever you share your data, more often than not, you are sharing other people's data as well. And that questions the moral authority we have to do that when we share data. Not only are we sharing other people's data, but it also has collective consequences, like the 270,000 people who donated their data to Cambridge Analytica. That had consequences for entire democracies. But it's interesting the example you give. If you write something down about someone, do they have the right to rip out the page? Legislation varies a lot in this sense, and I think there are some cases in which we might want to say yes. For instance, in Germany, if somebody takes a picture of you, an intimate picture, let's say you're partners, and then you break up, you do have the right to ask for those pictures back. And I think that makes sense.
So then, should we then say one way that this argument usually goes is something like, it's data about me, so it's my data in the sense that I own it, so I should have control over it. I should be able to do what I want with it. Whereas it seems to me you're going from a different direction. And tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but your point is more like, look, we've got this right to privacy. It can be infringed in various ways. We can be wronged, even if we don't know that it's going on. And are you from there giving an argument for why we ought to have ownership over our data? Even though we don't now, and that's not part of the argument about why we ought to have control. So to put it again slightly differently, people think we own our data, so we ought to have control over it. And I think your argument sounds more like we ought to have control over it, so we ought to be able to legally own it.
No, I don't
Okay.
think we should legally own our data because I don't think we have the moral authority to sell our data in many cases, not if it's going to share other people's data as well, and not if it's going to have collective consequences. So I think there should be minimal requirements for safety having to do with privacy that nobody can trump, not even if you want to share certain kinds of data. You can't because society has an interest that you don't do that. But then over and above those kind of minimal requirements, then yes, we should have control over our data. But I don't think it should be ownership because one of the most toxic practices related to privacy is the buying and selling of personal data. So I think we should outlaw that. And I think even in the most capitalist of societies, we agree that there are certain things that are outside the market. So we don't buy or sell votes, we don't buy or sell organs, we don't buy or sell the result of sports matches. And for the same reasons we don't buy or sell votes, we shouldn't buy or sell personal data.
That's a robust position. Comparing data about us to something like literally physical organs that we have. What's the call then? Is the call to action, or you wave a magic wand and what happens is that corporations stop collecting, corporations and governments stop collecting data about us, barring something like a warrant to do so?
So in Privacy is Power, I have two whole chapters on exactly what to do and how to implement the kind of suggestions that I give. And it's not going to be one thing. There's no
Sure,
magic wand.
sure.
But the first thing is to ban the trade in personal data. So it doesn't mean that your doctor can't collect personal data.
Of
It means
course,
that
yeah.
they can't sell it, and that's a huge difference. And likewise, some companies can have good reasons to collect some personal data, and that's fine, but they can't sell it. And it's also necessary to have minimum cybersecurity requirements, which we currently actually don't have.
Sure.
It's also necessary to have fiduciary duties. So whoever wants to collect personal data, that's fine, but they have to accept a responsibility of care towards the data subjects because that data is very sensitive. It can be easily misused. So they need to be responsible for it. And if they don't want to be responsible for it, that's fine, but then don't collect it. Just if you want to be a doctor, that's fine. But if you want to open someone up with a knife, then you have to take responsibility. And if you don't want to do, that's fine. So don't become a doctor. I think there are also different ways to design the digital world that are more privacy respectful. So one practice that should become standard and isn't is periodically deleting personal data. Whenever we don't need it anymore, we can delete it. So at the moment, anything that gets collected is pretty much permanent. And I think that's a mistake. There are also certain kind of techniques like differential privacy and homomorphic encryption, and there are others in which we can achieve the same results with either no personal data or much less personal data or personal data that is protected much better. So I think it's going to be a host of solutions.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree that there's not going to be the silver bullet that fixes all the issues. We have a right to privacy. I take it that's a kind of bedrock. We have a right to privacy. The right to privacy includes, at least among other things, the ability to control who sees what about us, so to speak, where the C is metaphorical. Is the issue because if we didn't do that, then people would have government. When I say people, governments, corporations, whatever, those who collect the data would have undue power over us, such that they're capable of harming us, and they have it in a way that we can't control, and so they're violating our right to privacy. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. So maybe to put it in a very short way, privacy protects us from possible abuses of power.
So let me ask you one other question. I can see. So there's no data that's inherently private. What's private information depends upon what we want to keep private or not, right? So if we lived in compassion world where everyone only ever exhibits compassion towards other people's sufferings that arise from medical conditions, we might not at all care about whether people know our medical information because it's only ever going to prompt compassion, not being taken advantage of or discussed or something along those lines. So then I start thinking, okay, so being private is not an intrinsic property of data. It flows from what kind of data we prefer people to have about us or not to have about us. And then it just sounds, okay, so privacy is just about respecting people's wishes. But then privacy is not the fundamental moral notion or something like that. It's just a matter of respecting people's wishes. That's the foundational thing.
So first of all, when you call it preference, it makes it sound as a preference is something that I prefer chocolate to vanilla.
A strong, a moral preference, or I don't know, whatever. There's degrees of preference. Take, I don't know, Blackburn's levels of emotional assent or whatever.
So even then, I think I would put it a bit stronger that we have certain kind of claims based on interest, depending on the kinds of creatures we are. And that's really important. It depends on the kinds of creatures we are. Of course, morality, arguably, the whole of morality or the whole of ethics wouldn't really be relevant if we have a society in which everyone consistently do the right thing, whatever that means, right? Or something like that. So I think some idealized circumstances obscure what we're after, and to think of a society in which everybody acts compassionate all the time towards
Well,
medical data doesn't recognize the kind of social reality that makes it the case that it's necessary to have both privacy and reflection about ethics.
yeah. The thought experiment is just supposed to attempt to show something like what constitutes private data what constitutes private data turns out to be not something special about certain kinds of data. It's just that there's certain kinds of data that people don't want to share with others. And then we say, okay, so it's really a matter of, I was just repeating what I said earlier, which is that it's a matter of making sure that you don't do things with data about people that they don't want you to do. I don't think that way about fairness. I think that people could want to be treated unfairly, for instance, that they might be making a mistake. They want to be treated in a way that positively undermines their autonomy. Nonetheless, I think that might be it'd be ethically objectionable to act in that way, let's just say. I don't think about general all moral concepts are just reducible to don't treat people in a way that they don't want to be treated. But I guess I'm not sure how to think about why certain data is special in a way that doesn't reduce to people prefer you not to have that data.
So 2 things. One is personal data is the kind of data that is about yourself and that makes you vulnerable to others. And as long as human beings are human beings, there will always be temptations for abuses of power. So I'm not sure how much it makes sense to factor that out. And secondly, I think there's an argument to be made that just there might be people who might want to be slaves, and you might think it's still unethical to treat them as slaves. You might think there might be people who want to be watched all the time. And you might think that's unethical too, because it does interfere with their autonomy, just on account of the kinds of creatures we are. Mammals don't act the same way when they're being watched, period.
Yeah. Okay. Carissa, we're going to call it there. Thank you so much. I feel like if we kept going, we're going to go into deep philosophy world, which I would love to do, but I'm not sure that everyone is going to follow along with us. But this has been really interesting and frankly helpful, because I find it in some ways difficult to think clearly about privacy, and the Achilles examples gives me pause, but you are giving me pause for thinking about that people really are wronged by virtue of having certain data collected about them, even if they're not harmed. And it's something that we need to take seriously. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Reed. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design a podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Kultgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.